Hello, everyone. Shavua Tov again. That's what we're up to. I am again recording a daf ahead of time. Today's daf, which is the daf for Sunday, whatever the Sunday is. Sorry, I'm just gonna find. There we go. Hopefully, you can hear me and see me. Today's daf is for Sunday, sometime in Adar, and it's daf Mem Bet Amid Aleph. So 42 in Masechet Menachot. I recorded last night's daf, which was Motzei Shabbat or Shabbos' daf, and we got yesterday in the recording at least up to the Tanura Banan. 6 lines, 7 lines from the top of Mem Bet Amid Aleph. We're talking about the mitzvah of tzitzit. Says the Gemara Tanura Banan, says the Braita, tzitzit. It says in the pasuk, you put tzitzit on the knaf of your beged, on the corner of your beged. Says the Braita, ein tzitzit ela anaf. Tzitzit means something that is like it hangs down. Anaf is like a branch that comes out of something. Chenu Omer, and so too it says in the pasuk by Yecheskel was talking about the vision from the Malach. It says, "Vayikacheni b'tzitzit roshi." He took me by the tzitzit of my head, and that refers to the hair, right? So not a nice way to be picked up and carried in that case to Jerusalem, but is what sticking out of your head is your tzitzit, and so what sticks out of a beged is the tzitzit. Now says Abaya, therefore, there's a lot of different ways to look at this, but one way to read this is that because the tzitzit have to be distinct, they can't be, sometimes you have a bunch of threads coming out of something, they curl around each other, especially if they're rubbed against each other, and they form like a ball. But that's not good. They have to be distinct. Tzarech lifroda kitzutzita darma. You have to separate the strings like the hair of an armai. An armai is some kind of hair where they would braid it close to the head and then let it come loose so that there were like maybe braids near the head and then there was a lot of hair coming out, but it wouldn't basically get stuck together because there was a separation at the source. And so the same thing is true about your tzitzit. You have to be careful they have distinct strings coming down. The Nurabanan. Now says the Braita, let's give you some details. Hitil al Karen. If you put the tzitzit on the corner, meaning not, you remember we said you're supposed to be a border between the edge of the baged and the tzitzit. They shouldn't be on the corner, they should be close to the corner. So if you put them literally on the corner, oh al gadil, or the gadil, most understand Rashi understands the gadil means the double layer of border of like over stitching that's done at the edge to protect the garment. That is kshira. That is okay, even though it's not ideal. But Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov says posel b'shteihem. Rebbe ben Yaakov disagrees and says that is too far. You have to have it in. It can't be at the edge of the beged. It has to be somewhere inside. We saw yesterday, and we're going to discuss it again today, that there is a limit to how far away from the corner it can be, but it can't be, according to Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov, directly on the corner or directly on the edge. Ask the Gemara, Azla, Damar of Gidol Marav. Gidol Marav said, tzitzit tzricha shetehei notefet al hakeren. The tzitzit need to be hanging down. Notefet might mean overlapping, like otif, right, over the corner, meaning they can't be in the corner, but they have to be over the corner. Kim shenemar al kanfei bigdehem, because it says it should lean over the corner of your bag, and meaning not be in the corner, but drape over the corner of your baguette. Come on, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. That's Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov's shita, which is that the tzitzit are not supposed to start in the corner of the baguette. They're supposed to drape the corner of the baguette, meaning you have to go in a little bit, a shear, and you have to then put your tzitzit. Amar Rabbi Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, how much is the shear? Meaning how far do they have to be from the edge? Tzarech shiarchik melo kesher godo. They have to be far enough, the hole has to be far enough from the thumb, a thumb width from the edge. So you have to think of the thumb and that amount of space till the edge is how much you're supposed to put them towards the middle, essentially, of the baguette. Now, remember yesterday we had a discussion about how far away they need to be, meaning they're not allowed to be too far from the corner because it has to be the corner. We had a machloket yesterday about 3 or about 4 etzbaot. Says the Gemara, well, you need both halachot. You need Rabbi Yaakov, who just said how far it has to be from the corner, and Rav Papa, who said how close it has to be to the corner. Right, so Itzach to Rav Papa. You need Rav Papa yesterday, who said 3 fingers or 4 fingers. There was a machloket, but Rav Papa paskin 3 away from the corner. And Itzchak Rabbi Yaakov said it has to be essentially 1 thumb's width away from the corner, because one is a minimum shear and one is a maximum shear. Meaning, Imid Rav Papa Hava Mina, if we only had learned Rav Papa's halacha that it's supposed to be 3 etzbaot away from the corner, I would have thought Toch Shalosh. If you if you're not supposed to have it, um, sorry, the opposite. Toch shalosh, it has to be within 3 finger widths from the corner. It shouldn't be too far away. Don't make your tzitzit in the middle of your beggar. They got to be close to the edge. But kama de mikrav ma'ali. Maybe the closer you get to the edge, the better. So don't. So what Rav Papa was saying, it can't be more than 3 finger breadths away from the corner, from the edge. But maybe it could be 1 or 2, or even right up next to the edge. Therefore, it's just Reb Yaakov. You need Reb Yaakov to come and say, at least according to his opinion, don't put it right on the edge, right? Put it at least a thumb's width away from the edge. V'imid Reb Yaakov, if you only had the halacha of Reb Yaakov, you might have thought he said, 1 second, Havamina malo kesher godal. You have to have it far enough away, like a thumb. Excuse me, it shouldn't be too close to the corner. But if you want to put it 5 finger widths away, that's fine also. Kama derachik mali, the more you put it away from the edge, the better. Tzricha, and therefore you basically need both halachot, one telling you that it can't be directly on the edge because it has to hang over the edge, not be tied into the edge. And one telling me that it can't be too far away from the edge because then it's not the corner anymore. Then it's in the middle of the baguette. And that's not the way tzitzit are supposed to be. So it's supposed to be not more than 3 handbreadths, and say handbreadths, finger widths, not more than 3 etzbaot or 4, a different machloket yesterday, and it has to be malo godel, has to be a thumb's width away from the edge. Now, there was a time, now we get to some stories, we are up to, looking at the place here, it's a little hard to find it, we are up to Ravina. I don't really know how to find the place. It's around 20 lines down. So Ravina, it's the second one on the line. Ravina and Rav Sama, Ravina and his colleague Rav Sama Haviyatvi Kamed Rav Ashi. So they were once sitting in front of Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi was the teacher in Bavel, and they were sitting in front of him. Chazia Rav Sama lekarne deglime de Ravina. Rav Sama noticed out of the corner of his eye that the corner of the shirt of Ravina, satar. It was torn, right? And basically, batzar mimelo kosher goda, right? So you have on tzitzit, for example, you have a square. You sew your tzitzit here. It's a thumb's width away from the edge. But as often happens with tzitzit, but it happens with any kind of knot, it basically tore through, right? The pressure or pulling it tore through where it started, and actually the beged became looser, and the knot was, or the tie was pulled through the beged to such an extent that the tzitzit was no longer a thumb's width away from the edge. It was closer to the edge. So the whole thing got pulled down. So Amrale, so Rav Sama said to Ravina, Lo Savel Amar, Hadar Rab Yaakov, what happens, Ravina? Ravina, you forgot Rab Yaakov? Rab Yaakov said it has to be more than a thumb's away from the edge, and your tzitzit are pulled down and they're closer than a thumb to the edge. Amalei, Ravina said, yeah, that's nice question, but you misunderstood Reb Yaakov, because Reb Yaakov only meant that you have to fashion it that way. Amalei b'shat asiyah itmar. Reb Yaakov was only talking about when you make the tzitzit, you have to make them so that you place the tzitzit, the hole for the tzitzit, more than a thumb's width away from the edge. But once you have them, certainly it's not a problem if it pulls down a little bit and it's closer to the edge. The only issue is when you make it. So Ichsif, Rav Sama got embarrassed because he realized that he had this big question on Ravina, and Ravina basically dismissed it because he said you didn't understand it. Amalei Rav Ashi, the teacher, Rav Ashi was in front of them. Rav Ashi said to Rav Sama, "Don't titkeflach, don't feel so bad about being embarrassed by Ravina, because Chad Minayu, one of them, Ravina was a scholar from Eretz Yisrael. Chad Minayo, one of them, Mibnei Eretz Yisrael, is as good as Trey Minan, is as good as two of us. So, he comes from a different milieu. He comes from a different league. Don't be embarrassed that Ravina got you on this one. Ravina is something special. So that was Rav Ashi's way of making his student feel better. Now, in further halachot, and a lot of what we're about to talk about is not how we paskin, but just important, some details that, remember, we talked before that your tzitzit have to have 4 strands. Beit Hillel said 3, but let's just say 4. And we said earlier at the end of yesterday, top of today's daf, or wherever it was, that's the halacha, that you have to have 4 strands. Now, we generally think you make a hole in the corner of the beged, you put your 4 strands through, and they drape down so that you now have 8 strings, and you tie them together, right? And you tie the knots on top, and you let it hang free in the bottom. But Rav Acha bar Yaakov He didn't do it that way. What he would do is he would rami arba. He would take the four strings, va'ayif lemeaf. He would first fold them in half. So basically, he took his four strings, and I don't know if this is helpful, but he took four strings and he made them like this. He folded them in half. So now they looked like eight, even though they were attached. So it's really four. And then avak luhu mevak, and then he attached them through the beged. So basically, what he took four strings, went through the beged, and then he took the eight ends, and he wrapped them through into the hole. So he essentially made a knot in itself, right? So that essentially the way he did it, he took the four strands, put them through the corner, put them through the hole, wrapped around the eight that the four strands went into, and put them through those four. So and then he pulled it as a knot. So the reason he did that is that his opinion was that you need to have eight strands when it's in the beged. But inan tamnaya beglima, you have to have eight when you put it through the beged. So putting four strands through the beged is not going to fulfill the mitzvah of having all eight. Now, of course, if you have eight strands, put it through the beged, you'll have 16. So the way he did it was he put four through the beged and then looped the other side of it around so that all eight went into the beged. He wanted to fulfill the psukim that describe having four double strands, which is what we learned from Gedil and Gedilim, in the place where you put them into the beged. So that was the way Rav Acha bar Yaakov did it. It's not the way we do it, but that's the way Rav Acha bar Yaakov did it. Rabbi Yirmiyah Midifti, he got around the problem because he just put eight into the beged. Rami Tamnai put eight strands into the beged. Of course, if you put eight strands into the beged, then you're going to have 16. 16 hanging down. The inu shitzar, right? It turned out to be 16 strings hanging down from the beged. He didn't tie them and loop them the way Rav Acha bar Yaakov did. So that was because these Amoraim were worried that although you're supposed to have four that go into eight, the eight are supposed to be put in the beged. So one solution is just put eight into the beged, but then you have 16 hanging down. Rav Acha bar Yaakov's solution was take the four, put in the beged, and then take the eight and wrap them through the four so that you have the eight basically end strings coming down from the same knot of the beged. And Marbrei de Ravina said, this is too complicated. Avikidi done. He did it the way we do it, right? Now, of course, the way we do it doesn't tell you anything, but assuming that everyone today does it the way we do it, which is the way we do it, which is where you just put four strands, you put them through the bag, and you let them hang down. So they didn't, this was a little bit too complicated, and no one ended up, not no one, but Marbrei de Ravina didn't do all these complicated knots. Now, Rav Nachman, where am I? Rav Nachman, we are at the 10th to last narrow line, I think is the way I would count this, on Daf Membet Amud Aleph in Mesechet Menachot. Rav Nachman was once Ashkechei, the Rav Ada bar Ava. Rav Nachman came once and he found Rav Ada bar Ava, who was sitting in his home, and Rami Chutei, he was preparing tzitzis, right? Which is he was taking the strands, putting them into the beged, knotting them together, putting, I don't know if anyone here has prepared tzitzis. I've done it before. It's a time-consuming process. It's like knitting. Not that I've knitted. The kamivarech lasot tzitzit. The Rav Ada bar Ava would take the tzitzit and put them in the beged. He would make a bracha, asher kedishanu mitzvotav etzivanu la'asot tzitzit. God commanded us to make tzitzit, and that's of course what the pasuk says. You should make tzitzit. Amar leis Rav Nachman said to Rav Ada bar Ava, what bracha are you making? My tzitzit kashamana. I hear you say the word tzitzit. I'm not familiar with that bracha. Hachi Amar Rav. Rav said to us, tzitzit ein sricha bracha. You don't make a bracha when you make the tzitzit. Of course, when you put on tzitzit, you make a bracha. But when you make the tzitzit in the beged, you don't make a bracha. So that was Rav Nachman told Rav Ada bar Ava that you're mistaken. Rav told us don't make a bracha when you sew, or not sew, when you weave or tie tzitzit. Now, that was Rav Nachman's opinion. Now, kinach nafshi de Rav Huna. Now, when Rav Huna, remember Rav Huna was the student in Surah of Rav, right? And after Rav died, Rav Huna took over eventually. And when Rav Huna died, all Rav Chisda, so Rav Chisda, who was a Talmud Chaver of Rav Huna, he was a student and a partner, he was very old, he took over just at some point, and he came and got up to give a speech, and he said, "Lememra derava derav." He asked a contradiction, a stira, a contradiction of one statement of Rav and another statement. And he said, everyone knows the story of Rav Nachman, who found Rav Adarava and said, don't make a bracha when you prepare tzitzit. Because Rav said, Mi Amar Rav, tzitzit ein tzarich bracha. Is it true that Rav said that making tzitzit does not require you to make a bracha? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, but we have another statement of Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, where the fifth to last narrow line. But Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Rav Yehuda was quoted, the name of Rav is saying, Minayin letzitzit ba'oved kochavim Chipsula. How do you know that if a non-Jew, or now Oved Kochavim, which is always debatable whether it's the Girsa there or Goy, whatever, how do you know that a non-Jew who makes tzitzit, those tzitzit are pasul? Shenemar, because the pasuk says, "Daber al bnei Yisrael v'asulahem tzitzit." Speak to bnei Yisrael. We read the psukim, and they should make tzitzit. Bnei Yisrael yasu v'lo hagoyim yasu, lo avdei kochavim yasu. That bnei Yisrael make tzitzit, but not avdei kochavim. Okay, so that was Rav Chisda said. I have this big contradiction in Rav, because Rav Nachman quoted Rav as saying that you don't make a bracha when you make tzitzit. And Rav Yehuda was quoted Rav as saying that a non-Jew is not allowed to make tzitzit. Well, says the Gemara, so what's the contradiction? Those are very unrelated halachot. One is that a non-Jew can't make the tzitzit, and one is that a Jew makes tzitzit, makes a bracha, or doesn't make a bracha. Why is Rav saying don't make a bracha a contradiction to saying a non-Jew can't make tzitzit? Says the Gemara, Hamayrunya. What's the contradiction between the two statements of Rav? Says Rav Yosef, you missed the point. Rav Chisda asked the question because Rav Chisda assumed that you knew, because of Rav Chisda made an assumption that how do you determine whether to make a bracha on something or not? And Rav Chisda had a rule, which he must have learned from someone, that kol mitzvah shekshera be'ovei kochavim, any mitzvah that is allowed to be done by an ovei kochavim, right? So an act of mitzvah, let's say making tzitzit or building your sukkah or whatever, that is allowed to be done by a non-Jew, if a Jew does that, he doesn't have to make a bracha. And it's sort of logical because the non-Jew is not making the bracha. He's not commanded to make tzitzit. So if he can make tzitzit, then clearly there's no bracha on tzitzit. And if I make tzitzit as a Jew, I don't make a bracha. But the flip side thinks Rav Chisda, kol mitzvah shipsula b'ovei kochavim, anything that a non-Jew cannot do, well, then it's clearly something unique and special about this mitzvah. And Yisrael tzarich levarech. And if a Jew does it, he has to make a bracha. Right, so the question now becomes, says Rav Chisda, that if Rav said that a non-Jew cannot make tzitzit, that implies that there's a mitzvah in making tzitzit, and a Jew who makes them should make a bracha. But now we have a contradiction, because Rav Nachman quoted Rav as saying, don't make a bracha. Rav Yehuda quoted Rav as saying, a non-Jew can't make tzitzit. How do you reconcile those things? So we don't have an answer. But before we get to that, well, we don't have an answer yet. Says Gemara, but is this really true? Is this klal that Rav Chisda assumed? Sorry, 1 second. Is this klal that Rav Chisda assumed correct? That in fact, if a non-Jew can make it, if a non-Jew can participate in making the mitzvah, you don't make a bracha, and if a Jew has to do it, you make a bracha. Is that a true klal? The klalahu? Harei mila. Let's get some other examples of actions where you either make a bracha or don't make a bracha. So what about a very, very important example, of course, of Brit Milah? We're in the second of the in-between, the medium, narrow, wide lines on Daf Membet Amud Aleph. What about the mitzvah of Brit Milah? Diksher b'ovei kochavim. You don't need to be Jewish to do a Brit Milah. How do I know that? Tanya. We have a Beferish Braita that says, Ir she'ein bo rofei Yisrael. Let's say you're a Jewish doctor. Of course, I'm a doctor, but I don't do Brit Milah. But a Jewish doctor there meant a person who does Brit Milah. Rashi says the word Rofe means mohel, right? So the Jewish mohel is not available. There's no Jewish mohel in that city. V'yesh Rofe Armai. You have a Rofe who's Armai. Armai is a non-Jew. And you have a Rofe Kuti. You have a Rofe who's a Kuti. Now remember, Kutim are Jews. They converted, but then turned out that they converted and they never really accepted Judaism, and they were worshiping the Yonah on Har Gerizim, so they had their own sort of religion, but they were accepted as Jews, and we made them into water carriers. So they're, I'll say quasi-Jews, but they're Jewish, but they're not, they don't follow the same Torah that we follow. So you have a doctor who's an Arma, you have a doctor who's a Kuti. Says the Braita, what do you do? Right? Now, of course, if a Jew had to do it, you would just say, wait for a Jew, or I don't know, something like that. But says the Braita, Yimol Armai, let the non-Jew do the Brit Milah, Al Yimol Kuti. Don't let the kuti do Brit Milah because Divrei Rabbi Meir. This is Rabbi Meir's opinion. And Rabbi Yehuda says the opposite. You should have a kuti, v'lo armai. You should have the kuti do the Brit Milah and not the armai. But again, that's obviously not our issue. We talked about this in Masechet Avodah Zarah. But the point you see from here is that you don't need to be Jewish to do Brit Milah, right? And according to the principle that Rav Chisda assumed in Rav, if a non-Jew can do the mitzvah, you don't make a bracha. But of course, everybody knows we make a bracha on Brit Milah, right? Ubi Yisrael tzarich levarech. When we do a Brit Milah and a Jew does a Brit Milah, they make a bracha to Amar Mar, as we said in the Tosefta. Hamal, the person doing the Brit Milah, Amar, Omer, he says, Baruch Asher Keshalom Tzvotav Tzivanu Ala Milah. So there's a requirement to make a bracha. So this principle that Rav Chisda said in Rav is clearly invalid because Rav says if a non-Jew can do it, you don't make a bracha. Here, a non-Jew is allowed to do Brit Milah, and a Jew makes a bracha. But that's not according to Rav. Midiu time Rav. You're only asking a question according to the opinion of Rav. But Rav mifsal pasal. Rav himself said a non-Jew cannot do a Brit Milah. Itmar, we had a statement. Minayin lemilah be'oveiko chavim shepsula. How do you know, unlike the Braita we just quoted, that a milah done by a non-Jew is pasol? Daro bar Papa mishmei derav. Right, Daro bar Papa is famous for the siyam, right? But Daro bar Papa said in the name of Rav, Amar, va'atat briti tishmar. You meaning you, Avraham, and your children, you protect my brit. So according to Rav, you're not allowed to have a non-Jew do a Brit Milah. Rabbi Yochanan says, I have another proof, which again, not arguing with Rav, but I agree that a non-Jew can't do a Brit Milah, because it says, Himol Yimol, same right description of Hashem's mitzvah to Avram, you should do Brit Milah, but it says Himol Yimol, and we darshan that Hamal Yimol. The one who's required to be Brit Milah, meaning a Jew, he's the one who can do a Brit Milah. So according to Rav, it turns out that a Brit Milah is possible by a non-Jew, and that might be why Rav says make a bracha if you're a Jew. So far, Rav Chisda's principle can maintain that if it's required to be done by a Jew, you make a bracha. If it's possible to be done by a non-Jew, you don't make a bracha. However, says the Gemara, it's not going to hold up water because sukkah is misayele, right? So building a sukkah supports this understanding of Rav, which is nice. But tefillin havi tiyufta. But once we get to tefillin, the whole thing makes no sense. So we're gonna entertain you. We know it's going to throw it out in the end, but let's talk about sukkah. The hare sukkah, building a sukkah. Who's allowed to build a sukkah? Kshera b'oveiko chavim. A non-Jew can certainly build a sukkah. Didanya, we have a beferish braita in Masechet Sukkah, Sukkat oveiko chavim, which we understand to mean a sukkah built by oveiko chavim, right? And where am I? Sukkat oveiko chavim, Sukkat nashim. This does not mean built necessarily by a woman, built for a woman, but specifically for use of a woman. Or sukkot mehima, a sukkah that's built for animals to, rest in, like a barn. Sukkot kutim, a sukkah built by kutim, and sukkah, it's sukkah mikol makom kshira. All types of sukkot, whatever they're built for, whoever builds them, they're kosher. Bilvat shem suchachet gilchata, because as long as that's schach, but it doesn't matter who made it. It matters that it was made. Ubi Yisra. So you see, right, that by a sukkah, basically a non-Jew is allowed to make a sukkah, right? And according to Rav's principle, as understood by Rav Chisda, if a non-Jew can do it, then you don't make a bracha. And in fact, that's true. B'Yisrael ein tzarich levarich. When a Yisrael builds his sukkah, you don't make a bracha la'asot sukkah or al binyan sukkah. The Tanya, as we had another braita Masechet Sukkah, ha'osa sukkah la'atzmo, Omer, if you're making your sukkah, you say, Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech olam. Where am I? It's funny that we have the whole thing, right? 3 lines in the bottom. Blessed are you, Hashem, she'achiyanu v'kimanu nigiyanu l'zman hazeh. Right? Now, we don't generally do this, and if you recall, we have that the bracha of Shechianu on the first night of Sukkot covers the building of the sukkah, but the Braita says at least you make a bracha of Shechianu, and ba le'shev ba, when you go to sit in the sukkah on Sukkot, you say Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher geshalom mitzvah v'tzivanu le'shev ba sukkah, as a bracha familiar to all of us. But there's no bracha al binyan sukkah, bilu la'asot sukkah lo mavarech. So this is very much supportive of Rav Chisda's rule in Rav that if a non-Jew can make it, then you don't make a bracha. Which now turns out, according to this, a non-Jew can build a sukkah, you don't make a bracha. A non-Jew cannot do Brit Milah according to Rav, so you make a bracha. A non-Jew cannot make tzitzit according to Rav, so therefore you should make a bracha. And the question we asked in the beginning was, why don't you make a bracha when you make tzitzit, right? But says the Gemara, this is all a very nice drasha and limud and pilpul, and I'm glad we covered all this, but it's wrong. Because tefillin tiyufta, tefillin proved that this principle is wrong. The last line. Hare tefillin dipsulot b'avei kochavim. A non-Jew cannot make tefillin. The Tani Rav Chinina Breder Rava, mi parshina. Sorry, I got to figure out how to turn the page. On my online Gemara. Okay. Rav Nachman, Rav Chinina Breder Rava mi parshunya, top of daf mem bet amud bet, said the following. Sefer Torah, tefillin, umezuzot. If you have a Torah, you have tefillin, you have a mezuzah. Shekatvan. Now the girsa here is a little bit unclear. The girsa again, my gemara is a little bit. I have a sheet on the bottom which says shekatva min. I can't read the next word, and oveko chavim. Right. So maybe min kuti oveko chavim. It's probably when I'm not exactly sure, to be honest with you, but a sefer. The point we have a sefer Torah tefillin mezuzah that is written by a min, which is a non-believer, right? A Jewish non-believer. A kuti is what we talked about before, someone who converted but under false pretenses. Ovei kochavim, a regular non-Jew. An eved, a slave, an isha, a katan, a woman who's not chayiv in them, or a child. Or Yisrael Mumar, or Yisrael who went off, and why that's different than a min is a different discussion, just to be clear. But any of those people who wrote tefillin, Sefer Torah Mizuzot, Pisulan, right? They are puzzle, okay? Shenemar, because it says, Ukshartem uchitaftem. You should tie them on you, and you should write them. Kol sheyeshnu bikshira, yeshnu bichtiva. If you have the mitzvah to say to put them on, by tefillin, then you have a mitzvah to say to write them, or you can write them. Anyone who is not allowed to, or not mitzuvet to put them on, not allowed, not mitzuvet to put them on, is not supposed to write them. So this seems to be an agreed upon rule, that a non-Jew should not write a Sefer Torah, tefillin, or mezuzah. So according to Rav's principle, as understood by Rav Chisda, you then don't make a bracha when you write them. But that's not true. I'm sorry, you do make a bracha because a non-Jew can't do it, but that's a mistake because Yisrael ain't tzarich levarech. It turns out that you don't make a bracha. So even though it cannot be done by a non-Jew, a Yisrael who writes tefillin doesn't make a bracha. Because there's a famous principle about the brachot of tefillin that was sent by Reb Chia, the son of Rav Huna, in the name of Reb Yochanan. Al tefillin shel yad, when a person puts on their tefillin shel yad, Omar, they say, Baruch Asher K'Shalom Mitzvah V'Tzivan Laniach Tefillin. Make a bracha about putting on tefillin, which we discussed yesterday, I believe. Al tefillin shel rosh, when you put on your tefillin shel rosh, you say, Omer, Baruch Asher K'Shalom Mitzvah V'Tzivan Al Mitzvah Tefillin. But there's no bracha anywhere, ilo la'asot tefillin, la'mevarech. There's no bracha about making tefillin. So you see from here that even though a Yisrael has to make the tefillin, you don't make a bracha when you do it. And the same thing would end up being true about tzitzit. That even though Yisrael, according to Rav, has to make tzitzit, and they can't be made by a non-Jew, you don't make a bracha when you make them. Why? So that's okay. So fine. You answer Rav Chisda's question. But then what is the principle, right? How do you decide when to make a bracha and when not to make a bracha? Rav Chisda came up with a great explanation, which was you make a bracha when a Jew has to do it. You don't make a bracha when it can be done by a goy. But that's wrong. So what is the reason? Alav hainu taima. You know what the reason must be? Here's the difference. Kol mitzvah da'asiyata gemar mitzvah. Any mitzvah that when you do it, you're finishing the mitzvah. So, for example, kigon milah, right? You're doing a brit milah. The act of doing the brit milah fulfills the mitzvah of milah. So, avagav diksher ben ovei kochavim, even though a non-Jew can do it, when a Yisrael does it, Yisrael tzarich levarech. So, therefore, it's not dependent on non-Jew Jew. If a non-Jew does it, that's okay. But when a Yisrael does it, if they're fulfilling the mitzvah with the act, they make a bracha. But kol mitzvah da'asiyato lav gemar mitzvah. But in any mitzvah, we're just making it. You didn't fulfill the mitzvah. Kigon tefillin, right? Because the mitzvah of tefillin or tzitzit is not necessarily, well, we'll get to tzitzit in a second. The mitzvah of tefillin is not writing them and tying them, it's putting them on yourself. So the act of writing them is not fulfillment of the mitzvah. And so afagav de psulot b'aveko chavim, even though it can't be written by a non-Jew, you don't make a bracha. B'Yisrael ino tzarich levarech, which implies that you could, but halacha is that you don't make a bracha. A Yisrael doesn't make a bracha. Why is there a machloket about tzitzit? B'tzitzit, where we had a machloket earlier about whether or not to make a bracha. Remember, Rav Ada bar Ava was making his tzitzit and he said a bracha, and Rav Nachman came and said that's a mistake. What's that based on? Bahal kamiflagi. Mar savar chovat talitu. Remember, we talked about this yesterday. Again, I'm confused by my days because I'm in the future, but I think we talked about it yesterday that the mitzvah of tzitzit might be a mitzvah on the actual garment. That if you have a garment that's meant for wearing that has four corners, put tzitzit on it. In which case, the moment you tie those tzitzit, you fulfill the mitzvah, so you make a bracha. So Mar Savar, it's a chovat talitu. It's a responsibility on the garment, on the person who owns the garment, but on doing it on the garment. Umar Savar, the one who says you don't make a bracha, Ravina, he quoted Rav Nachman, who quoted Rav, chovat gavrahu. It's a chova of the individual. So making a tzitzit doesn't fulfill anything. You have to then put it on, and it's only when you put it on that you make a bracha. But obviously, the bracha you make then is to put on tzitzit, not a bracha to make tzitzit. And so that's what it depends on. Okay. Whew. So that is the long explanation of the machloket about whether a non-Jew can make tzitzit and whether you make a bracha on tzitzit and all the different opinions about how these things go. Now, said Rav Mordechai to Rav Ashi, once we got this whole Gemara going, Aton hachimat nitulo. You're the ones who learned this halacha about whether a Jew or a non-Jew, whether a non-Jew is allowed to make tzitzit from this whole lima that you had that we just discussed, right? About can a non-Jew make it, a non-Jew can't make it, and what's the halacha of a bracha. But anan hachimat nitale. We learned the same halacha in a little bit of a different way because we learned it the following way. Amar Yehuda Marav. Rabbi Yehuda is quoted in the name of Rav as saying, "The minayin litzitzit sorry, minayin litzitzit be'oved kochavim shekshira." How do you know that tzitzit? I'm almost halfway down. How do you know that tzitzit made by a non-Jew are kosher? No, we had the whole lima before, but here Shenemar Rav Yehuda Marav quoted a pasuk as saying, it says, "Daber al bnei Yisrael ve'asu lahem tzitzit." Speak to bnei Yisrael and make for them tzitzit. Who's making for them, right? Meaning, yasu lahem achirim. Other people can make for them, meaning non-Jews are allowed to make tzitzit for them. And so this, according to this limud of Rav Yehuda Marav, a non-Jew is allowed to make tzitzit. Okay? Now, what you said earlier too, but that's not the reason that is not the reason that you don't make a bracha on tzitzit. Now, Amar Yehuda Marav. Now, continues the Gemara now, again, almost halfway down. There's a star in mine, at least, which shows the Masoras Hashas. Says Rav Yehuda Marav that if you make your tzitzit min hakotzim, kotzim literally means the thorns, but it means the little pieces of fabric that are coming down from the bottom. And if you recall, the tzitzit really, according to many opinions, don't have to be as long as we make them. So a little bit of strands, when you have, before they had machines, of course, you were sewing things together. There were strands that weren't cut off at the end. If you make tzitzit out of those little thorns, strands of clothing, of garment, or min hanimin, right? Nimin are actually threads, so they're not like little pieces of fabric. They're really firm threads that just were used, but they're left over at the end. Umina gardin, which literally means the strips. It's not so clear exactly what it means in this case, but some other part at the bottom of the beged, right? So all of those cases, says Rav Yehuda Marav, they are psula. But if you make it min hasisim, now sisim are basically, they call them like longer amounts of wool, basically, that are not spun for the purpose of tzitzit. So basically they are regular things of wool that are spun together, but they're not made for the purpose of doing tzitzit. In that case, it's kshera. So it's possible if you have these very small, basically things on the bottom, right? Rashi is a little bit unclear as exactly why. Here he says you need to do it lishma. Earlier we talked about making tasev lo mina asoi, right? That basically they have to be placed there for the purpose of doing the mitzvah. But if they're spun shelo lishma, meaning you did the spinning without intention for tzitzit, but then you took them after you spun them and you took the what's it called, the pieces of yarn or wool, and you put them into the beged and tied them together for tzitzit, that's okay. Because at least you're placing them in for tzitzit, and the tying, of course, is done l'shma. So that would be kosher. Now this is what Rav Yehuda Marav said. Ki amrita kamei de Shmuel, when they said this in front of Shmuel said, no, no, no. Af min hasisim psula. Even if the spinning of the wool into threads was done shalol lishma, that is possible. Because ba'inan tivia lishma, you need even the spinning of the wool into threads to be done l'shem mitzvah tzitzit. And so if you just go to the store and you buy threads, right, and then you put them in your garment and tie them, that's not kosher according to Shmuel. Kitznai. In fact, it's a machloket tanaim. Because there's one, the Braita says the following: tzipan zahav. Let's say you took your this is talking about tefillin here. You took your tefillin and you covered them with gold, right? Because you figured that. I mean, I could imagine that, right? You want your tefillin to be as beautiful as possible. Or behemat tmeah, or you cover them with the skin of a non-kosher animal. You have some skin from I don't know, a lion, that I don't know, some other animal that's very beautiful, from a lizard maybe, and you put it on your tefillin, psulot. Those are puzzle, right? Because of course it has to be from a kosher animal. Says the Braita, or behemata or akshirot. Of course, if you put the skin, the leather from a kosher animal, it's kosher. Says the Braita, afa bishul ibdan lishman. Even though you didn't prepare the skin for the sake of doing tefillin. So you took an animal, you turned its skin into parchment or into leather, let's not say the parchment, the leather, and then you bought a piece of leather from the store and made it into tefillin. So that's the equivalent to buying string from the store and making it into tzitzit. So the Tanakama seems to say it's kosher. And Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, I disagree. Like Shmuel said, Af ar behema Torah psulot. If you buy the skin, you buy a piece of leather from a behema Torah, it's also puzzle. Ad ya'abed lishman. It has to be made lishman. So the mitzvah is, and you know, of course we're machmer, but according to this, the mitzvah is to take from the earliest stage of either the wool for tzitzit or the skin of the animal to make leather. They do it l'shem the mitzvah. Obviously, this is complicated, but that's how the Gemara seems to conclude. Amar le Abaya le Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda. Now says Abaya, we're going to do a few more minutes. I don't really know how much time passed. Oh, 37 minutes. Okay, we got plenty of time. Says Abaya. Now, let me tell you where we're up to, where there's Tosfot said, Achi Abdun Lishman, it's to the left of that, one line below. So around 2/3 of the way down, Amar le Abaya le Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda. Said Abaya to Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, Hi techilta, this techelet, right? So we've been talking a lot about the mitzvah of techelet, which is a type of blue dye, right? Take wool, you dye it blue, and you put it in your tzitzit. Even if your tzitzit are linen, and the wool and linen makes kilayim, right? We said that would be permitted. But how do you dye it? Heicha tzavitalu. How do you dye the wool to make it blue of techelet? So Amrleh said to him, Maitina dam chilazon. You take the blood, and of course, chilazon, we think of it as a snail of some sort. So I don't know if it's not really blood, but the liquid, the juice, the excretions that come out of it. Visamanim, you take some herbs. Now it's not clear. Are you adding something to this? Are the samanim something that's part of it? I don't know the exact recipe, unfortunately, so I can't make techelet. But Rashi makes it sound like the samanim are sort of the normal background things that dyers use. He has a French word, beitza. I don't know what that means, but you take the juice of the chilazon, you take samanim, v'ramina lebiyora, you put them into the vat, right? You heat up the vat. Everyone knows that. V'shaklinan purta bebeata, you take a little bit of the dye with the eggshell, right? Meaning, which is the way they would take a spoon, right? They didn't have such good spoons. So you take an eggshell, which is a closed circular thing, and you take out a little bit of the dye, the tamina luhu udra, and you basically test it by taking a chunk of wool and dyeing it to see if it's correct. Then you throw away the egg, and you burn that piece of wool. Meaning, what's the point here? The point is, we'll say a little bit what the point is in a second, but I'll say it out loud first, is that you can't just say, oh, I want to test out this vat of tchelet. Let me dip a piece of wool into it and see what it looks like, right? and we'll see why. But we want you to take a little bit out of it and dye and test your wool, and then throw away that wool and throw away your eggshell. What do you see from here? Shema mina tlat. You see from here three things. Shema mina ti'ima psula. You see that the liquid that you use to test it is puzzle. So you can't test it in the liquid because then the whole vat will become puzzle, and you can't throw back the little bit that you have after you tested it, right? Because the testing it part is puzzle. Shema mina, the second thing you see from here is ba'inan tzvi'a lishma. You see from here that you need to have, sorry, the first thing you see is that ti'ima is psula, meaning, sorry, I'll say I mixed up the first and the third. The first one is that the wool that you tested is puzzle, right? And the reason for that is that you have to make this wool blue in order to do the mitzvah of tzitzit, of tchelet. But you made this wool blue in order to test whether you have the right color of blue. So since you were doing it to test, that is not kosher to be used for tzitzit, okay? So that's the first thing you see, that if you're just dyeing something to test, you can't then use that thing and say, oh, it's a perfect blue, let me put it in my tzitzit, because you didn't dye it for the purpose of tzitzit. That's the first one. You see from the second one that you actually have to have intention when you do the dyeing, right? Because if you're just doing it to test it, then it doesn't count as dyeing because you didn't have the intention. Ushmaminan, the third thing you see is ti'ima pasla. You see from here that if you take some of the dye and you use it to test, you can't then put it back in. Once you took it out, it puzzles it, and so you have to throw it away. Says Gemara, aren't the first two things the same? Right? The first two things are exactly the same. We said that the wool that was dyed for testing can't be put in your tzitzit. The reason it can't be put in your tzitzit is because you didn't dye it for tzitzit, you dyed it for testing. So that's the same purpose. That's telling me that you have to dye it on purpose. Says Rav Ashi, you're right. That's exactly what we meant. Amar Rav Ashi, ma tam kamar. You're right, which is a little strange because we said three things, and really it's not three. But we're saying, what is the reason? Ma tam ti'ima psula. Why is it that a piece of wool that was dyed blue to test the color cannot be put in your tzitzit? Mishum debe'inan tzvi'a lishma. Because the tzvi'a, the dyeing of the wool, has to be done for the purpose of tzitzit. And since you did this dyeing for the purpose of testing out the color to see if you got the right mix, therefore, it's not usable for tzitzit. It says more, in fact, Tanai. In fact, that is a machloket Tanaim about whether you need to actually dye it lishma, because ti'ima psula. The first Tana in the Braita says, we'll see who it is in a second, that if you are testing a piece of wool and you turn it blue, you can't put it in your tzitzit. Mishum shenemar, because the pasuk says kilil techelet. It has to be completely techelet, meaning, now of course that's referring to the beganim of the Kohen Gadol. But what we learn from here is that the techelet has to be done for the purpose of dyeing it, not for the purpose of testing it. Divrei Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel. This is the words of Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, not a commonly quoted Tana. Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavai Omer. Rabbi Yochanan ben Dahavai said, no, it's not a big problem. You don't need to do it lishma. Because afilu maresh sheni sheba kasher, even a secondary appearance, meaning even if something came into it because you were testing it for something else, the fact that it's blue and it's tchelet means that it's tchelet and you can put it into your tzitzit. Mishum shenemer ushni tolat. We learn from the fact when the Torah talks about not in this context of talit, but it talks about the dyes that they use in the Beit HaMikdash. It says shni tolat. Tolat is a scarlet, usually a red, or dark red. But shni, which literally means the wool, but here it means sheni. It could be a secondary thing, meaning you don't have to dye it on purpose. It could be that it just happened to be that color. In which case, if you dyed it to test it and you got the perfect blue, you can use that for your tzitzit. So that's a machloket. Tanura banan. Now, while we're on the topic of how you do tzitzit, question is, should I keep going? I'm going to do it. 1 second. Wait, no, I'm actually going to stop here. I'm going to stop at Tanura banan. So we will stop here, 5 lines from the bottom, Tanura banan on Daf Membet Amabet, and tomorrow, which will be a Monday next week, God willing, we'll pick up the halachot of how we do tchelet and how they are placed into tzitzit, how the dye is known, how you test it, how you know if it's really tchelet. Remember, we had an equivalent to tchelet called kala ilan, which is another blue dye. How do you know if it's the right thing? And so we will discuss that all going forward. Shavua tov, everyone. Hope some people get this recording. Thank you.